In one of the hungriest nations on earth, where the red dust of the Sahel swallows harvests year after year, the government of Burkina Faso did something so strange, so unthinkable, that the world could not resist laughing. They took food, 200 tons of ripe watermelons, and buried it deep beneath the desert sands. To Western eyes, it was madness. Newspapers in London and New York ran cartoons of African leaders tossing fruit into a pit, while analysts mocked the waste of crops in a country where mothers still count every grain of millet. Commentators asked with a sneer, why would a starving nation bury food in the desert? But that is where the misunderstanding begins. Because what the people of Burkina Faso buried was not food. It was a challenge, a question, a seed of defiance against the chains that have bound African agriculture for decades. They laughed because they did not understand. This is not a story about melons. It is a story about soil, about sovereignty, and about the quiet revolution now rising beneath the sand. What seemed like destruction was, in truth, design. The initiative was called Project Oasis, a name whispered at first, then spoken aloud with pride. It did not begin with a press conference or a parade. It began quietly, with trucks loaded with cracked and overripe watermelons, driving north into the sun-scorched Sahel. Agricultural teams dug wide pits in the dust, lowering the fruit as if planting a harvest in reverse. Why melons? Because watermelons are more than sweetness. They are water reservoirs wrapped in green skin, over 90% liquid, carriers of potassium, magnesium, calcium, and organic carbon. When left to rot in open air, they are waste. But when buried deep, they transform into sponges beneath the soil. As they decompose, they moisten the earth slowly, feed the hidden microbes, and restore life to soils long stripped bare by drought and wind. Independent agronomists were invited to observe. They measured. They compared. In plots where melons were buried, the soil held moisture not for 4 days after rainfall, but for 14. Millet seedlings pushed roots deeper. Germination was quicker, stronger, more resilient. It was as if the soil, long forgotten, had been given a memory again. The Ministry of Agriculture released early figures. Moisture retention, up to 3 times longer than untreated soil. Soil respiration, microbial activity increased by 35% in the first season. Organic carbon, a measurable rise in soil fertility indicators. Seedling survival, millet and cowpea germination improved by nearly 40%. Economists soon joined the conversation. A preliminary report from the Ministry of Finance projected that if even a fraction of the nation's agricultural waste were redirected underground, fertilizer imports could drop by 15% within 5 years, saving tens of millions of dollars. Those funds, officials argued, could be redirected toward electrification, healthcare, and rural education. And the raw material? It was already there. Every year, thousands of tons of fruit and crop residue rot unused in Burkina Faso's markets and farms. Mango skins, citrus peels, groundnut shells, millet husks, even animal manure. For decades, these were seen as garbage. Project Oasis reframed them as treasure. One scientist from Ouagadougou University remarked, "We have been told for years that Africa's salvation lies in imports, in chemicals, in foreign seed packages. But here we see salvation in waste, in what our markets throw away. This is not backwardness. This is a form of intelligence the world forgot. It was not high-tech. There were no billion-dollar machines, no patented formulas. It was low-tech, decentralized, and replicable in every village. And that was exactly what made it dangerous to the global system. Because for more than half a century, African agriculture has been framed as a story of deficit. The narrative was consistent. Africa is hungry because Africa lacks inputs. Fertilizer, pesticides, improved seeds, all imported, all controlled by global supply chains. The continent was told, "You cannot feed yourselves without us." Every season, ships left European ports loaded with fertilizer. Every season, aid agencies delivered packages tied to contracts and conditions. But beneath that model, soils became addicted to chemicals, requiring more every year. Local seed varieties disappeared, replaced by hybrids that could not be replanted. Farmers were trapped in debt, and when aid stalled or politics soured, hunger followed. Dependency had been written into the soil itself. Project Oasis flipped the script. It demanded no imports. It relied on no foreign patents. It did not bind farmers to contracts or debts. Instead, it turned local waste into local fertility. Every village had the material. Every farmer could replicate it without permission. One international observer, speaking privately, admitted, "The danger of Project Oasis is not that it fails. The danger is that it succeeds, because it proves Africa does not need the system we built around it." And indeed, this was why the buried melons drew such laughter at first. Laughter is often the first defense of power when it senses its own fragility. Because if melons can feed microbes, microbes can feed soil, and soil can feed a nation, then what place is left for billion-dollar fertilizer industries? What place is left for aid contracts written in Brussels, Paris, or Washington? This was not just biology. It was politics hidden beneath the sand. It was, in every sense, an African scientist's breakthrough, and the first stirring of an African agro-tech revolution. When the first signs of success emerged from the buried melons, when moisture lingered, when millet seedlings rose from dust that had been silent for years, the government of Burkina Faso knew it was time to speak. Not with whispers, not with reports, but with a declaration. In a nationally televised address earlier this year, President Ibrahim Traoré stood before his people and the world. Behind him, screens showed two photographs. On the left, cracked barren soil from a control plot. On the right, a stretch of green where melon burial had taken place. "This," he said, "is not theater. This is evidence, and evidence does not require permission." But his words carried more than science. They carried defiance. If the world will not sell us fertilizers without chains, we will create fertility with what our land already gives us. If they say survival must come from abroad, we answer that survival can grow beneath our own feet. The statement was not only about soil. It was about sovereignty. For decades, Burkina Faso's farming cycles had been tied to foreign inputs. The numbers were stark. Over $100 million annually spent on imported fertilizers across the Sahel region. Contracts often bundled with conditions, subsidies tied to political compliance, loans enforced by donor institutions. As much as 60% of rural farmers depended on packages of aid-linked inputs to survive planting seasons. To break free of this cycle was not merely an economic decision, it was an act of rebellion. And Traoré's words echoed a deeper history. For older generations in Burkina Faso, the memory of Thomas Sankara, the revolutionary leader of the 1980s, still lingers. Sankara had declared that he who feeds you controls you. He had urged Africa to consume what we produce and produce what we consume. But his revolution was cut short. Now, nearly 4 decades later, many saw Traoré's Project Oasis as Sankara's spirit reborn. A new attempt to sever dependency, this time not with guns or ideology, but with microbes, melons, and the quiet insistence that waste can be weaponized into freedom. International observers recognized the symbolism. A leaked EU diplomatic cable described the speech as an overt political challenge disguised as an agricultural policy. Another American analyst put it bluntly, "This is not about melons. It's about the narrative of Africa choosing itself." And indeed, the narrative was shifting. In villages, farmers began repeating Traoré's words as a kind of proverb. "If they will not sell without chains, we will plant freedom in the sand." The declaration had multiple layers: scientific, proving that organic waste could restore soils and reduce chemical dependence; economic, signaling an intention to cut fertilizer imports and save tens of millions annually; cultural, reclaiming dignity by showing that waste could become wealth. Political, announcing to donors and corporations that Africa was prepared to chart its own course. It was, in effect, a manifesto hidden within agriculture, and this was why the laughter of Western commentators slowly gave way to unease, because this was no longer a quirky experiment in burying fruit. It was a speech, a declaration, that Africa could reimagine its future without waiting for permission from the outside. One Burkina poet captured it best at a local rally in Ouagadougou. They gave us fertilizer in bags, with debts written on the label. But we answer with melons in the sand, with freedom written in their roots. This was more than farming. It was a revolution in disguise, a declaration planted not in parliament halls, but beneath the soil of the Sahel. The green shoots had barely risen from the sand when the backlash began. What started as laughter quickly turned into something sharper: fear. 6 weeks after the first melons were buried, a document surfaced online. It was a leaked memo from the European Agricultural Trade Association, a powerful lobby group representing fertilizer corporations. Its language was urgent, almost panicked. If Burkina Faso's melon burial method proves scalable, it read, it could destabilize demand for imported fertilizers across West Africa, jeopardizing billions in annual revenue. The memo did not call for scientific rebuttal. It did not question the data emerging from the fields. Instead, it called for narrative control. Among its recommendations, launch targeted media campaigns portraying the initiative as reckless, use emotional imagery, hungry children contrasted with buried fruit, to stir outrage, pressure donor agencies to distance themselves from Burkina Faso's agricultural program, highlight risks of pests, methane emissions, and uncontrolled decomposition. Within days, the shift was visible in Western headlines. Where once there had been mocking cartoons, there were now sharp accusations. A major U.S. outlet called Project Oasis an unsustainable stunt. A European paper claimed it was a smokescreen for deeper policy failures. One op-ed even suggested the project might mask corruption or foreign interference. Television commentators warned of turning poor Africans into guinea pigs. Reports from Brussels framed the experiment as a biological risk to regional stability. It was clear. The ridicule had given way to resistance. The campaign extended beyond words. Western donor agencies quietly began delaying disbursements for unrelated agricultural programs in Burkina Faso, citing concerns about experimental policy directions. A European think tank, funded by trade interests, released a polished report claiming Project Oasis could destabilize rural markets by promoting non-standard practices. It called the project romantic populism and argued that chemical fertilizer was still the only scalable path to food security. In Washington, officials avoided public comment, but intelligence briefings referred to Burkina Faso's agricultural pivot as a symbolic geopolitical realignment. Internal memos warned, if replicated across the Sahel, this model undermines the aid architecture we have relied upon for decades. For fertilizer corporations, the threat was not imaginary. West Africa alone represents a multi-billion-dollar market for imported inputs. If countries began composting their own waste instead of importing chemicals, entire supply chains, from European ports to African distributors, would be disrupted. Inside Burkina Faso, the memo's leak had an explosive effect. Radio stations read its contents aloud on morning broadcasts. Talk shows erupted in debate. In marketplaces and mosques, people asked, if this project truly threatened no one, why were powerful institutions so desperate to stop it? Opposition leaders seized the moment, demanding investigations into the costs and environmental risks of the project. Protesters in Ouagadougou carried signs, "Where is our food?" Images of trucks dumping fruit into desert pits felt distant, even absurd, to city dwellers who never walked the Sahel's cracked fields. But in rural communities closer to the test sites, the mood was different. Farmers who had seen seedlings sprout in soil once abandoned responded with quiet determination. One man, Soline, a veteran once stationed at border outposts, stood before a local radio microphone and said, "We used to guard borders. Now we guard the soil. One protects territory. The other protects the future." His words spread quickly across the provinces. Women's cooperatives, youth groups, and school children began volunteering to monitor burial sites. Agricultural agents offered training. What began as a government initiative was quietly becoming a grassroots movement. The government moved swiftly to counter the smear campaigns. In a televised broadcast, the Minister of Agriculture stood beside side-by-side images. On the left, barren, cracked soil from a control plot. On the right, a patch of green millet where melons had been buried. "This is not theory," she said. "This is evidence, and evidence does not require permission." Independent scientists from regional universities backed her claim. Early studies reported microbial activity plus 35% in treated soils, germination rates plus 40% for millet and cowpea, moisture retention up to 10 extra days in test plots. Even skeptics began to reconsider. Callers in Mali asked if their surplus baobab pulp could be buried the same way. In Chad, village leaders requested Burkina Faso agronomists to train them. Senegalese universities launched competitions for alternative organic soil amendments. The backlash in trying to discredit the project had instead amplified it. The fertilizer lobby's greatest fear was coming true. The debate was no longer about whether melons could revive the soil. It was about what happens if Africans no longer rely on imported solutions. One retired diplomat, who had spent decades working on agricultural aid in the Sahel, admitted privately, "The story has always been simple. Africa needs help. But when Africans help themselves, especially in ways we did not script, the narrative breaks. And breaking the narrative is what scares people most." This was the heart of the backlash, not just against melons, but against meaning, against the possibility that Africa might find in its own waste the seeds of its independence. And in the boardrooms of Brussels, the think tanks of Washington, and the lobbies of Paris, unease was spreading. Because if Project Oasis could take root, it was not only soils that would change, it was the balance of power itself. While Western headlines debated and lobbyists sharpened their attacks, a quieter revolution was unfolding in Burkina Faso's villages. For in the end, the true measure of any agricultural experiment is not what experts say, but what farmers see with their own eyes. And what they saw was green. In the northern province of Seno, a farmer named Adama had grown used to failure. For 10 years he had thrown millet seeds into dust, praying for rain that never stayed. Year after year, nothing answered. His children learned to live with hunger. Then came the melons. After his village joined Project Oasis, Adama stood before journalists, pointing at a row of young millet shoots piercing the sand. "We threw seeds into this dust for 10 years. Nothing answered. Then we buried the melons and the soil woke up. I don't care what they call it. I see green. My children will eat." His voice, weathered and firm, was more convincing than any government report. Elsewhere, in the village of Liptugu, a man named Soline had once patrolled the nation's borders as a soldier. Now he patrolled fields. On community radio, he shared his perspective. "We used to guard borders. Now we guard the soil. One protects territory. The other protects the future." His words spread far and wide, becoming a refrain for a new kind of patriotism. Across northern provinces, local defense volunteers, once trained to fight insurgencies, began organizing to protect fields, water points, and burial sites. Women, too, claimed their place in the revolution. In towns like Kaya and Fada, cooperatives began organizing melon days. Spoiled fruit was gathered from markets and redirected to burial pits. With technical guidance, women learned to mix melon pulp with crop residues and charcoal dust, creating nutrient-rich compost. Small batches were sold to neighboring villages, the profits reinvested in school supplies, water wells, and solar lanterns. One mother in Kupela held up her child's new backpack and said simply, "The melon gave us this." Waste had become dignity. Even children found a place in the movement. Teachers turned the science of watermelons into lessons. In classrooms near Bobo Dioulasso, students carried fruit into demonstration fields. Each child was allowed to bury one melon. They called the act planting water. Years later, educators would say the children may forget the numbers, but not the symbolism, that even something fragile could restore what was thought lost. Beyond emotion, the impact could be measured. A government survey of households involved in Project Oasis found families saved up to 20% on farming inputs in a single season. Villages generated microeconomies around compost and organic soil treatments. Youth participation in agriculture increased as young people chose to stay rather than migrate to the cities. The most profound change, however, was harder to quantify: attitude. For decades, rural communities were told salvation would come from abroad, from fertilizers, from aid shipments, from foreign experts. Now they saw salvation in their own hands. Markets once clogged with spoiled fruit found new purpose. Traders organized with cooperatives to collect waste. Women gained authority as knowledge keepers of composting techniques. Youth rediscovered pride in farming. What began as a government initiative was no longer only that. It had become a grassroots movement. Farmers, mothers, children, veterans, each group found its role. Civil society organizations, once skeptical, began to shift. While still demanding transparency and environmental monitoring, they acknowledged the success of community engagement. The project was no longer just about melons in the sand. It was about a nation learning to see its waste not as shame, but as salvation. Graffiti began to appear in Ouagadougou, green fists breaking chains, vines climbing out of buried melons. Street musicians sang ballads about the water beneath the dust. Protesters at unrelated rallies invoked the imagery of planting freedom. The language of agriculture had become the language of sovereignty. And for many Burkinabe, Project Oasis was no longer simply a government policy. It was a mirror of dignity, reflecting back the idea that Africa could rise, not by waiting for handouts, but by reclaiming the wisdom in its own soil. This was the meaning of the people's rise, quiet at first, then unmistakable. A movement not of protest, but of participation. Not of anger, but of awakening. Because in Burkina Faso, the melons buried in sand were no longer just fruit. They had become roots, roots of resistance, roots of rebirth. By the time green shoots began to rise from the Sahel's cracked crust, Project Oasis was no longer just an agricultural trial. It had become a mirror, and in that mirror, the world saw itself. In Washington, officials at USAID and the State Department avoided public comment, but internal briefings told another story. Policy analysts described Burkina Faso's experiment as a symbolic geopolitical realignment. One internal memo, circulated within donor circles, warned, "If models like this spread to fragile states, particularly those questioning aid, the architecture of agricultural assistance could collapse." The problem was not the melons. It was the message, "We don't need you." For decades, American influence in the Sahel was measured by aid packages, by bags of fertilizer stamped with donor logos. If African nations proved they could compost their own waste into fertility, the very foundation of that influence would weaken. In Brussels, the reaction was even sharper. The leaked fertilizer lobby memo was not an isolated outburst. EU-funded think tanks soon released reports warning that Project Oasis promotes non-standard practices that could undermine regional markets, risks fostering antagonism toward foreign partnerships, could destabilize a multi-billion-dollar fertilizer industry anchored in West Africa. One European diplomat admitted in private, "If Africa feeds itself with its waste, what exactly are we selling?" The unease was not only economic, but cultural. For decades, Europe positioned itself as the provider of agricultural modernity. Now, an African innovation was threatening to flip the script. From Moscow, the tone was triumphant. Russian media praised Project Oasis as a victory for post-colonial innovation, drawing parallels with Soviet-era resourcefulness. Commentators argued that Burkina Faso's defiance proved Western dependency models could be broken. One Russian journal called it the first green flag of sovereignty in the Sahel. For Moscow, it was less about melons and more about geopolitics, another chance to position itself as an ally of African independence against Western dominance. In Beijing, agricultural journals dissected the burial method in detail. Articles examined microbial responses, soil moisture retention, and cost-effectiveness compared to chemical fertilizers. Chinese officials suggested similar low-cost techniques could be tested in Central Asia and drought-prone provinces in Western China. Unlike Europe, China did not dismiss the approach as reckless. Instead, it treated it as a possible template for scalable, low-tech soil restoration. Turkish outlets offered yet another angle, framing Project Oasis as a marriage of science and ancestral wisdom. To them, the act of burying fruit carried echoes of traditional practices, returning nourishment to the earth rather than discarding it. One Ankara columnist wrote, "The West sees waste. Africa sees memory. This is more than farming. It is reconciliation between land and people." But the most important reflections came not from global powers, but from Africa itself. In Mali, evening radio shows debated whether baobab pulp could be used the same way. In Niger, agricultural students organized design contests for low-cost composting systems. In Chad, community leaders invited Burkinabe agronomists to demonstrate techniques. In Senegal, an agricultural college launched a national competition for alternative organic soil amendments. The laughter that once rang from foreign capitals was replaced by curiosity in African classrooms, villages, and radio stations. One farmer in Niger summarized the mood. "If Burkina Faso can make the desert answer with melons, why can't we?" By now, Project Oasis was no longer a local experiment. It was a mirror. And in that mirror, each power saw its own reflection. For Washington, it reflected risk, the risk of losing narrative control. For Brussels, it reflected loss, the potential collapse of lucrative fertilizer markets. For Moscow, it reflected proof that the West's model could be resisted. For Beijing, it reflected opportunity, a chance to adapt and replicate innovation. For Africa, it reflected rebirth, the rediscovery of dignity in local solutions. As one Burkinabe professor put it, Project Oasis has become more than melons. It has become a mirror, showing each power what it truly fears and each farmer what is truly possible. By the end of the season, the debate over melons had grown larger than the fields, larger than Burkina Faso, larger even than the Sahel. What began as a question of agriculture had become a question of power. Because buried melons will decompose, yes, but the ideas they carried, sovereignty, resilience, dignity, do not rot. They germinate. Across West Africa, communities watched closely. In Mali, farmers spoke of adapting the method with baobab pulp. In Chad, elders asked for training to try melon burial with native gourds. In Senegal, students debated whether peanut shells could heal exhausted soils. Each conversation was proof that the story had already crossed borders. And in the West, unease grew. Aid contracts were quietly reviewed. Fertilizer companies met behind closed doors. Diplomats whispered of unpredictable narratives. The laughter that had once greeted Burkina Faso's experiment was gone. What remained was silence, the silence of power confronted with something it could not easily dismiss. For President Ibrahim Traoré, Project Oasis was never just about melons. It was about ending a system that fed dependency more reliably than it fed people. It was about proving that survival need not be imported. For the people, it was about more than soil. It was about memory, about reclaiming the dignity that comes when solutions grow from one's own land. One Burkinabe farmer captured it best. "We buried fruit, but we unearthed freedom." The seeds of defiance planted in the Sahel now raise a question for the world. Can a nation truly feed itself without the scaffolding of global aid? Can sovereignty be composted from what others call waste? Can dignity grow from decay? For some, these questions are threatening. For others, they are liberating. But for Africa, they are inevitable. This is not just about Burkina Faso. It is about every place told that survival must come with strings attached. It is about every farmer who has been taught to wait for ships and shipments instead of trusting the wisdom of their own soil. So the call is simple. Share this story if you believe Africa's solutions must be born from African soil. Subscribe if you believe buried seeds can break the silence of the world. Because sometimes, the most radical act is not to fight with weapons, nor to shout in parliaments, but simply to plant waste, to plant memory, to plant defiance. The desert, they said, always wins. But in Burkina Faso, a people knelt, not to beg for rain, but to plant rebellion beneath the sand. And from that rebellion, green shoots are already rising.